I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I am chatting with Jared Michaud. Jared has had a lifelong drive to write fiction. Growing up, his mind was shaped by the stories he read. From C.S. Lewis to Orson Scott Card, he found authors who knew how to speak to his heart and give voice to what was inside of him. He started writing stories himself when he was only 7 years old and wrote his first novel starting when he was 12. Today he writes from a little house in a little town in Wyoming, where he lives with his wife and 6 children. He is a Christian and a lover of truth. He is on a mission to give his children's generation myths built on the greatest foundation the world has ever seen. Welcome to the show, Jared.
Thanks, Kara. It's good to be here. It's good to talk to you.
Yes, I know. I'm very excited about this. I just finished your book last night, so I am very excited to chat with you about it.
Awesome.
Well, I feel like we are so much more than our bio. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Well, as the bio says, I started writing when I was real young, but I had a pretty hard growing up time. So my imagination was sort of an escape for me. And so the world that went into Brightstar, my book, started when I was very young. And, you know, as I don't know how other people have done it in their imaginations, but when I was a kid, I put myself into the stories that I read, whether it was Chronicles of Narnia or Star Wars or Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card or any of those stories. I would put myself into each one of them and tell a story about me being there with the characters. And as time goes on, these worlds all started to meld together to be their own thing, my own world, which was the Energemetra 6 universe. And when I was 12, I started writing the first book in that universe, which is not Brightstar. It's
interesting.
It's the prequel, but what I wrote was a prequel. And if you've ever, so have you watched the Star Wars prequels?
Oh gosh, my husband has, and I've tuned into some, but
here's the point. Here's the point. A prequel is always a prequel because you know where it has to end.
Yeah.
You have to engineer the story so that it winds up in a particular place. And as a 12 to 16-year-old, I did not have the skill to write a prequel in a way that was anything other than sort of stilted and formulaic, because I knew where it all had to end.
Okay.
Now I think I could maybe tell the story a little better, but at the time I got 200 pages in at 16 years old, and I looked at it and I went, this is unpublishable. This cannot be a good story. It isn't going to work.
Wow. I'm impressed that you knew this at 16. I'm very impressed right now.
Well, you read a book and you read your own work, and you can go and you can kind of compare the two, and you can kind of go, this just isn't up to the level of good stories. It's not there.
Yeah.
And I knew it. So I put it aside. When I was first married, 22, 23, I tried writing again. And for various reasons, that didn't work out the way I had thought it was. So I put it aside, and I didn't write for 15 years.
Wow.
And then
did you have any nudges along the way?
I sure did. And I'd start a story here and start a story there and this and that, but none of them ever really came to anything. I was working on building a video game at the time, and that sort of involved my creative brain, so it kind of kept me going. But a couple of years ago, in January of 2022, I got the feeling it was time. It was time. It's like God had brought me to a place where I could actually write the story I needed to write. And so I sat down and I started. It took me 6 months to write the first chapter, and then quit my job for unrelated reasons. And over the next 6 months, I wrote another 100,000 words. Wow. And Brightstar is half of that. So the second book is already written.
Wow.
So there's another one coming. It's already written. But that's for down the road. Right now it's Brightstar. So that's
Yeah.
sort of in brief a story for about me, I guess.
Yes. What I find so impressive is the first part of what you said is you started writing to escape, when I feel like most people will also come to reading to escape, right? That's kind of our
Well,
release.
I actually didn't start writing to escape. I started
Okay.
imagining to escape. The world
Okay.
started coming together there, but the writing was because I felt a need to do it, and I have ever since I was a kid.
Yeah.
There's an author who I have some respect for, Andrew Clavin,
Okay.
uh,
Yeah.
has said, "You aren't a writer because you write things. You're a writer because you can't help but write things, and if you don't write, you're unwell." And that's kind of me. If I don't create, I become unwell. So,
Yeah. And that's exactly how he talks. A
well,
little bit.
that was almost a direct quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So, and then the other part of that is that I had a question. So you're like, okay, it took me 1 month to write the first chapter, correct?
6 months to write the first
6 months
chapter.
to write the first chapter. So then after that, did things, once you kind of got that start, it sounds like then things were just kind of flying onto the page from there.
Well, I quit my job for unrelated reasons after that first
Okay.
chapter, and I started praying about it. I'm like, is this a good thing to be doing with my time? And the answer I got was a yes. So
Yeah.
I actually focused in and started writing 1,000 words a day, which
Yeah.
for a lot of authors that's not a lot, but considering what I was trying to put into Brightstar, it was a lot for me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I like what you say there because I feel like I often pray about like being intentional with my time, right? And I imagine with your 6 children and your wife and a family, it you do have to think about these things, right? Is this being intentional with my time?
well, and I have to provide for these guys too. And
Yeah.
while I don't have a job, I'm not providing for them. And I don't know if you know this, but writing and publishing a book is not necessarily a good way to make money.
Yeah.
So
And it's a lengthy process from what from my
it
season
really
of
is.
episodes. Yeah.
It really is.
Can you tell us a little bit about, for the listeners that won't have read Brightstar at this point, can you give us a little background or a little blurb on the story for them?
Okay, so Bright Star is about a boy from our world who is he's autistic. He has and that comes from personal experience, by the way. I have some measure of that I wrote from. You can't do that without some personal experience and be genuine.
Sure.
But he's autistic and it makes his life really difficult. He has real difficulty doing the simplest things, but um he is transported to another universe. He doesn't understand how. He's transported to another universe, and that autism sort of turns into a superpower. It makes him able to control this mysterious energy field that makes up the basis of the universe. And in doing this, he sort of loses his memory, and he goes on this odyssey through the stars with these friends he meets along the way, and winds up in the crosshairs of some not very nice forces. And
Yeah.
I I would say that's sort of a brief overview. Nothing, I gave away too much there.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. No, we like to keep the episode spoiler free, so I think
right.
that's perfect.
Now, what I would really love to do at some point is get into myth a little bit,
Yeah, let's
especially
do it.
before we get to the flight, because it plays right in.
No, let's do it right now.
Okay, absolutely. So, um, let me read this quote first. This quote is by Ivan Illich. Neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new powerful tale, one so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes the preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and our present into a coherent whole, one that even shines some light into the future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. That's Ivan Illich.
Okay.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is what, as a writer, we do, what writers do. And the first thing that writers, uh, if you want to be a good writer, the first thing you have to do is tell a fun story, tell an entertaining, engaging story, right?
Yeah.
That's the first thing.
Get your audience.
Right. Well, and the next thing is to put some of yourself into your characters to draw the audience into the characters, make the characters sympathetic. The only way that I know to do that is by, like I say, putting some of my own experience into them. Um, and then the third thing, and I'm going to use a metaphor here. Um, the goal is, or actually, for most people, it's not really a goal, it's just sort of a need. And that is to expose some of the truth that's there in the world. So the metaphor is like this: imagine that the mountains are the skeleton of the world, and there are places where they sort of stick up through the ground. And like that, truth is everywhere around us, but there are places where the structure of it sticks up through reality. And a good writer, sort of instinctively or on purpose, depending on the writer, draws some of that truth into their writing and just leaves it there for people to experience. And that's where a lot of the stories that are really powerful, that's why they're so powerful, is because people do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the books that linger with you, right? They make you think, even challenge you sometimes, right? In the way that you are thinking. I actually have this book that I'm still thinking about. We read it for book club last month, and I think I've finished it over 3 weeks ago, and it popped in my mind again today. And it's like, wow. I mean, just how impactful stories can be. And I think exactly to your point, it didn't draw everything up in a nice bow at the end, but it brought you there to think about it.
That's right. And it just leaves the things that are true about the world there for you. And that's what I would term a myth, a story that exposes that truth for us to experience. And you know, like I say, some people are intentional about it and some are less so, but we'll get into that in just a second.
Yeah.
But the fourth thing that we shouldn't do as writers is to preach. Okay, so
I actually was going to say that is like, you can't preach to people either, right? It has to be they have to draw their conclusions from it.
Here's the way I've heard it put, and that I thought was quite good. Your license to preach is directly proportional to and less than your ability to tell a good story.
Hand in hand there.
Right, exactly. So the thing that I've really fastened on, though, with this myth thing is the role myth plays in our world. And I like to sort of describe it like this. You know how politics is downstream of culture? How the way culture is sort of shapes what you can do in politics?
Yeah.
Culture is downstream of faith. We live based on the things we believe in the most deeply, and that shapes the culture we create, right?
Yeah.
Myth sits somewhere between faith and culture. It points back to the faith that we stand on, to the things we believe, and it points forward to lead the way for the culture. When I was first creating the Twitter account for this book, there was a guy who said something that I could have hugged him. What he said was, well, it was kind of funny. I'm like, okay, so that's not an accident that I saw that. What he said was, there are some guys who take one story and make it their whole personality. For me, it's Starship Troopers. Okay. So, and I looked at this and I went, now what you just said is profound, and you probably don't exactly realize how profound, because as human beings, we take the stories that are important to us and we make them into a part of our core personality.
Yeah.
And I would even go so far as to say, you know, when God gave us the Bible, he didn't give us a systematic theology. He gave us a story. Yeah. And it's because he understands that that's what we need, that in order to be healthy people, we need to take those stories and we need to internalize them. And that is super important. And today in our culture, our myth is kind of broken. We don't have strong myth in this day. And that's why I started writing Brightstar, was because that myth is so important.
Yeah.
And that actually takes me right to the book flights that I had sort of wanted to cover here, if that's
Okay,
okay
well,
to do.
I actually have a couple questions, so hold on.
Please. Yeah.
So, as far as myths, I agree with you. I feel like we haven't had any of these great myth stories come out. And
Yeah.
I love what you're doing because I also have, as I told you before we got on, is I have three children myself, and it's made me think a lot about what is the culture of our home?
Yeah.
How am I teaching my children to show up in this world, etc. Like all the things that you're kind of saying. But I love that because it's, of course, literature is really important to me, right? And reading aloud. But I also want these books to end up in the hands of my children, right? And books that I want them to have. And so I just love I just wanted to say, like, I love what you're doing here with
Well,
this,
thank
like,
you.
bringing myth for our kids and our kids' generation.
I appreciate it. And it needs to be done intentionally, and it needs to be done carefully.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had to another point of what you were talking about, how we need the stories to kind of internalize these things. I've actually had two episodes that were more historical fiction based, but we talked about how history really doesn't imprint on you unless, well, A, you've experienced the history, right? Because you've
Sure.
experienced the story. But, we read about something for us that, maybe World War One or World War Two that we weren't around to experience. But when we read it in the form of a fictional story, it really does imprint on you. I think the story, like I remember that a lot more than verbatim trying to memorize that for a test I took in school, way back when.
Sure. Well, and you know, when Jesus was preaching on earth, he didn't just teach facts, he
Yeah.
told stories. He told parables. And part of the reason he did that is because they stick in the mind, because
Yeah.
they help you to, they sort of distill a truth, bring it down to a level that is, it may not be obvious, but it's contained in that story, right?
Yeah. And I think that was one of your initial points, right? Is we could also potentially see ourselves in those stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, anyways, before you went to the book flight, I wanted to ask you that. But
No,
actually, I
that's
do
great.
have
Yeah.
I have two follow-up questions because I imagine with your kids and your family life, you're pretty busy. So how do you structure your days? Do you write every day?
Well, I told you I quit my job a year and a half ago. We're still
Yeah.
living on savings right now.
Oh
So
my
yes,
gosh.
I
Wow.
write. Well,
Okay.
it's not been easy.
Yeah.
It has been very difficult, but yes, I'm writing every day. I
Yeah.
try to write 1,000 words a day when I can.
Yeah. Okay. And then I'm assuming you're reading every day as well.
I wish I don't get to
Okay.
read as much as I'd like now.
Yeah.
Well, and then some of the stuff I'm reading is when you become an author, your to be read list starts to be other authors that you run into. And
Yeah.
then you want to do reviews for them because that's what authors really need. Like,
Yeah.
seriously, that's what authors really need is reviews.
Okay. Listeners, you hear that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So so when I do get to read, a lot of times it's that stuff, which is still good and fun, but it's very rare that I get to do the whole brain candy that I really enjoy. And we'll
Yes.
get to one of those at the end, I think. But
I love
yeah.
that. Well, what genres do you enjoy? What would be your brain candy for that?
Oh, anything from very specific authors, like what would I say? There's the Monster Hunter universe is a lot of fun.
Okay.
Orson Scott Card and the Ender's Game stuff, space opera. David Weber. I've read just about everything David Weber has written because so much of his stuff is just fun. I
Yeah.
really enjoy it. Um, and then fantasy stuff. Back when I was a kid, I loved Harry Potter. I loved other things like that, same as most people do. The
Yeah.
fantasy and sci-fi stuff for me.
Okay. All right. Well, let's know. You've prepared a book flight for us. I'm very excited to hear that. So can you tell us a little bit about how they pair together first?
Well, the way I put this together was trying to play into the theme of myth and going by going by these stories have shaped society, shaped culture, shaped us in ways that others have not. And looking at the authors, how they intentionally or unintentionally put myth into their stories. And I think in some cases it was very intentional. And as you get toward the other end, it's a lot less intentional, but it still managed to catch something.
Yeah.
So that starts with C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Which is,
Yes.
I think, what would I say? Lewis was, the older I get, the more I appreciate him. He was like the central literary figure of the past 100 years, in my opinion, because of the insight and the depth to what he had to say. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, he goes through the story of children from our world who are transported into another universe to
Yeah.
experience a story that became an allegory. He told the story of Christ and what would I even say? All of the myth, all of the symbolism that he put into Chronicles of Narnia, starting with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then going into each of the others, from the magician's nephew at the beginning to the last battle at the end. He draws all of the myth very, very intentionally to the
Yeah.
surface and leaves it there for us. And when you do that, it's speaking from experience now, when you do that, it's really hard not to be too over the top about it.
Sure.
And Lewis actually sort of, if anything, he just did it on purpose and let it be what it was. And
Yeah.
it still made a great story. You know what? I think if you had to ask a million people what story they read to their kids, that would probably be the one that comes out on top of all of the choices. That'd be the most frequently read one for
Yeah.
this past generation because he did such a great job with it.
Yeah. I would agree with you on that. I mean, I've read him to my own kids, right? And I think about, I mean, I see some parallels of you know, what you're doing as well. Is he wrote this, was it for his granddaughter? I mean, he wrote this for someone in his family,
I
if I
don't
remember correctly.
I don't actually know exactly
Okay.
who he wrote it for. I know
His goddaughter.
the goddaughter part makes perfect sense for exactly
Yeah.
that reason. Yeah, that's so cool. But anyway, in Chronicles of Narnia, he goes through the story of what Christ did on earth, kind of step by step in an allegorical, um, what would you call it, retelling of the
Yeah.
events from the perspective of sort of not exactly outside observers. He does some fun stuff with the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve being destined to rule in the world of Narnia. I thought that was really interesting, and I may have pulled on some of those threads myself just a little
Yeah.
bit, right? But
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, and it's an epic book
it
or
absolutely
series of
is.
books, let's
And
say.
well, and I could have just gone Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but you kind of need the whole thing to get the epic
Yeah.
sense of it. And it's wonderful for that
Yeah.
reason.
This is what I envision, like in my ideal world of my family, as we're cuddled around the fireplace and we're reading aloud every night and all the kids are quiet and we're all engaged in these stories. This is what I envision as we're reading this series of books when I have this picture in my mind.
Absolutely.
So,
Well, and I don't know, some of I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is great, but I actually think if you want to really get into the places where Lewis was bringing myth out in that series, you need to get into The Last Battle, because some of the pictures he drew there and some of the things that he brought to the surface were both profound and truly insightful, things that you wouldn't get except through the lens of a fictional story pointed at a set of events that didn't actually happen,
Yeah.
but are portraying something that is yet to
Yeah.
happen. It's kind of
Yeah.
amazing.
It is. And I always think about with C.S. Lewis how he had that group, right? It was like, I think Tolkien we're talking about, right? It was Tolkien, C.S. Lewis.
And there were a
Yeah.
couple
And I
others
think about it,
too.
I'm like, how do I be? I want to find like a group like that in my world because they all were such impressive authors. It doesn't need to be an author group, but like what they did and brought to this world. And I just want to be in their conversation and hear it.
I can't claim to be that impressive an author, but I
Yeah.
aspire to it, right? What more can we
Yeah.
do? We aspire to.
And we can look
So,
at, like you said, C.S. Lewis, this literary great of our time, and past 100 years.
yeah.
And I think it's so important to have aspirations, right? We have to be reaching for things.
Well, and speaking of Tolkien, that sort of takes us
Yes.
right into the
Yeah.
next one, right? So the next one was Lord of the Rings. And in Lord of the Rings, I mean, everybody knows this story now. This is not something that I need to go over for people. Everybody knows the story. And it's because what C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien did, the reason people know them is that those stories, they have the qualities of myth. They exposed things that are truly
Yeah.
profound. That's the word I was looking for,
Yeah.
profound. And my one of my favorite scenes in Lord of the Rings is I'm thinking of the movie here, is the one where Aragorn is talking about there may be a day when the courage of men fails, but it is not this day.
Yeah.
And what a for the times we live in, that is such an encouragement
Yeah.
to me to be that character, right? To be the one who is doing the things that need to be done, saying the words that need to be said to create a story for people to stand on. And Tolkien
Yeah.
did it, and he sort of did it almost reluctantly, right? It was like he wrote this story as to go along with the language he invented. He wrote it for himself, not because he wanted to please his
Yeah.
readers. And I tell you what, as an author, there's sort of a formula that you're kind of expected to write
Okay.
for, right? You have to have a beginning and a middle and an end. You have to have character development where the character goes through a series of changes or whatever. And all of that is fine and good, but it's all kind of trappings. It's all kind of it's all if you have a really great story, you're working with that and kind of around it rather than making it the focal point of the story. The focal point of the story becomes this truth that you're
Yeah.
exposing in one way or another.
Yeah.
And Tolkien did that in a way that was, I can't help thinking he did it intentionally in a lot of areas, but he did it for the fun of it. He did it sort of for the joy of doing it, not because he had to, not because he was trying to please readers. And I aspire to that. I aspire to being able to bring things to the surface because they need to
Yeah.
be, and just leaving them there to be appreciated, understood, thought about, those sorts
Yeah.
of things.
And I've never thought about, as you've been talking, I've never thought about this in relation, right? I have never thought about the Bible. I mean, I have thought about the Bible and C.S. Lewis together, right? The Chronicles of Narnia together. I have.
Sure, sure.
Or like the Lord of the Rings. Let's tack them all in. But you go into these stories where exactly what you're saying. You're bringing the truth to the surface and you're leaving it there. You could read this story when you're 12, when you're 25, when you're 40, and I bet you're going to get something different out of that story every single time.
Well, and that's the mark of a great
Yeah.
story, isn't it? And I tried to do that with Brightstar to a degree too, where if you read it and you read the
Yeah.
Gospels, you're going to find parallels. You're going to find places where I was just trying to point to the true myth of Christ, the greatest
Yeah.
story our world has ever
Yeah.
known. And C.S. Lewis did it, and Tolkien did it to an extent
Yeah.
too, right? And for interestingly enough, in comparing Lewis and Tolkien, in some sense, Tolkien's story was actually more compelling than Lewis's. And I think it's for the reason that I already sort of mentioned earlier, that Lewis was doing the myth thing on
Yeah.
purpose, and Tolkien was more just doing it for the joy of it. And when you're doing it for the joy of it, your story is more
Yeah.
compelling. So I really tried to be there when I'm
Yeah.
writing. You know what I'm
Yeah. And
saying?
I think that that comes through on the page. Is, I mean, we're seeing it
Well,
between the
thank you.
two, right? And so exactly to your point,
Yeah.
that will come through in your writing.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
hope it did.
No, absolutely. And the other part of that is, okay, so you go, you read these stories, I feel like there is so much depth to them as well that like you can go back, and I am not a big rereader by nature, but these would be specific
Me
books
either.
that I could go back and reread because the story has so much depth. You know, it's not like I don't even want to throw a book out there, but like a book that I've read and
Pick one off of the Barnes and Noble's new releases
correct. Yeah,
shelf.
that like okay, yep, it had a beginning, middle and end and it tied up really nicely. I wouldn't be entertained if I went back and read it again, where these again the depth of the story and you're going to get something out of
Right.
it differently at a different age and a different era of your life, and you could go back and reread these probably every decade of your life and still get something.
Absolutely. And like I say, that's what you aspire to, right? When you're
Yeah.
creating, you
Yeah.
aspire to that.
The
You
lasting.
don't if you well, if you ever claim it, then you're being kind of
Sure.
arrogant. But if you aspire to it, then you're aiming in the right
Yeah.
direction. And it's for other people to decide whether you get
Yeah,
there,
I was
right?
just at the park this afternoon talking to one of my kids' friends. It was his dad was there, and we were talking about books because
Mm-hmm.
that's what I do. And he was saying that, oh yeah, I've read The Lord of the Rings 3 times, and I said I read it in high school, and I've been wanting to go back again now at this phase of my life because I think I would get so much more out of it. So I still have them on my shelf from high school. If that tells you anything else about me, that my husband's in the military. We move a lot. They've made every move with me. They're still on
Sure.
the shelf, and I'm like, okay, I think this 2024 is going to be my year to pick them back up.
I got to be honest with you, I've never read it all the way
Really?
through.
Okay.
I got through the first
Okay.
two and most of the way through The Return of the King, and it was during high school, and I'm like, this hasn't changed. I keep thinking it's going to get more fast paced, and it just
Yeah, we got
doesn't.
like extra credit, I think, for like we had to read Lord of the Rings. That was the required reading. And then I think we got extra credit if we read the next two. And so of course I was like seeking to get extra credit. So I was like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And
Of
so I
course.
did read them, but to my point is I think I was just reading it to get them done, to get the extra credit, not
Hmm.
really reading them for the enjoyment of the story.
And then the third one that I want to draw in here is almost totally different, but
Okay.
not. And here's why. It's the book Dune by Frank
Okay.
Herbert. And the first two writers definitely came at their writing from a Christian perspective, and some of their, whether their myth was intentional or unintentional or done for the joy of it or whatever, it was done with some awareness. What Frank Herbert did in Dune almost touches the other end of the spectrum, and what I mean by that is there is a tremendous amount of symbolism and um, some amount of truth that he brings up in Dune. And when you read it, not so much the sequels for me at least, but when you read the book, it kind of just sticks to you for that reason. And there are things that I thought about for years and still think about sometimes that he brought up in that story. And I don't know whether he did it intentionally or unintentionally, but even even so, it's like, some of the most um, when you go to music, for example, some of the most secular artists hit upon truths where I go, that's not by accident. That truth is there on purpose. That's being exposed. That's a real thing
Yeah.
right there. And Frank Herbert in Dune did the same thing. And for those who, Dune really isn't appropriate for
Okay.
kids, particularly. It's kind of a dark story. And my wife has been wanting to read it. She's finally reading it now, but I told her don't read it when you're
Okay.
pregnant because the emotional sensitivity she had when she was pregnant, it wasn't a time to be reading a dark
Yeah.
story like Dune. But at the same time, it is a very compelling story, and it too is a story with a chosen one in
Okay.
it, with a prophesied one. And the things that he draws out there have, like I say, left me thinking for a very long time. They're still on my mind today at
Yeah.
times. So that was why I wanted to bring that one in as well, because even there we see myth, we see truth, we see things being brought out that are
Yeah.
timeless. And you can see it, they're still making adaptations of Dune for the screen
Okay.
today, even though it was written like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I don't
Yeah.
know now.
That was going to be my
So,
question because my husband has read this, and I have
mhm.
not yet. But it was recommended by one of my friends that did a fantasy book flight, um, and but I was like, I think it had been made into a screen adaptation as well.
At least a couple of
Okay.
different times. Yeah, it has. And as with many of these things, it's really hard to do it
Yeah.
justice. They actually did a really good job with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when they adapted that for the screen. They actually did a really good job. Same with Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings. Dune, I haven't seen one that I thought they did as great a job because, like with Ender's Game, which I really wanted to do, but I saw somebody else had done it
Yeah.
in a book flight, so I wasn't going to do it. But the I thought that the movie adaptation of Ender's Game kind of fell flat. It didn't hit the dark psychological um, truth that Orson Scott Card was tapping into with Ender's Game, and likewise with Dune. I don't think that the screen adaptation really
Yeah.
hit it. That's my
Yeah.
opinion, anyway.
Interestingly enough, the episode we talked about Ender's Game, they have a podcast where they talk about books and movies and they compare, like it's hosted by two women and they compare like the screen adaptation
Uh-huh.
to the book and that's what their podcast is. It's called Off Script. So
Now that you say that, I remember looking at the episode and noting that that was the subject of
yeah.
that episode, which is cool.
Yes.
That's awesome. Well, maybe if Brightstar ever gets made into a movie, I'll
There
have to
you
talk
let
to
me
him.
know.
That'd be fun.
We started our podcast around the same time. So we've been
Hmm.
we keep each other in the loop of how things are going because we're kind of on the same, yeah,
That's
timeline.
awesome.
So, okay, well, now again, this might be my nudge to pick up Dune finally. I was just on my husband and I, the Kindle account is shared, even though we have two different ones.
Yeah.
And once I finished your book last night, I was like, okay, what book am I going to download now on Kindle? And Dune was on there.
You know, I would say
Okay.
try it, but don't necessarily force yourself through. If it gives you an icky feeling, just
Okay.
walk away.
All right.
Because Dune can do that. It's pretty dark, and the it's like reading Nietzsche, kind of. I don't know if you've
I
ever
have
read
not,
any of
no.
Nietzsche, but one of the points that I heard a Christian evangelist who I really respect make about Nietzsche one time was that he lived his worldview to its logical conclusion. He spent the last 2 years of his life
Yeah.
insane. Dune is sort of Dune sort of
It could get
resembles
you there.
that. It lives its world well, it lives its worldview sort of to its logical conclusion. It's very dark, and it does not exactly have a satisfying
Okay.
end, or it does not exactly have a satisfying resolution, at least
Yeah.
to me. But that's because I look at the myth of Jesus Christ, the true myth of Jesus Christ. It is the truth and it is also myth at the
Yeah.
same time, as the ultimate story. That to me is what we should be
Yeah.
aspiring to.
And that's your guiding light there.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, very much
Okay.
so.
All right. Well, thank you for that little side note. If it doesn't work, and that's what I think. Not all books work for everybody either, right? Like it has to work for you and
Yeah.
don't I've gotten better over the years with less time to like just, do not finish if it doesn't work for me.
I had uh, back when I had the book launch team for Brightstar getting started, I had a lady who wanted a copy of Brightstar. She started reading it. She got to like chapter 5 and she said she couldn't finish it. It wasn't her type of thing.
Hmm.
And at first I felt really
Sure.
disappointed, but then I thought about it and I'm like, I actually really appreciate that that if it wasn't her type of thing, she didn't feel like she had to keep going or something, that it was simply something she could put
Yeah.
down because it isn't for everybody. And
Yeah.
I know that.
Yeah. And I think when we put stuff out in the world, right? I mean, I had to think about that from the podcast too. It's right. Okay, I put this out there. This might not be for everybody, and that's okay.
I did have one other book that I wanted to bring up here.
Let's
You
do
want me to
it.
hit
Yep. We
that
got a
now?
dessert pairing today.
Okay, so I made this a dessert pairing because there isn't it will give you intimations of myth, but it's not that strong in that area, but it is a fun read and it's a standalone
Okay.
story. The story is The Apocalypse Troll by David Weber. This one also isn't exactly for little kids, though teens would be fine with it
Okay.
probably, if I'm remembering right. It's been a while since I read it, but you asked what sort of stories I do
Yeah.
for fun. That story is the sort that I really enjoy. It's a space opera story that where of a main character who finds an alien basically the ship crashes into the ocean next to him. He rescues this alien out of the ship and it turns out she's human. And he's like, okay, what the heck is going on? And so the story has time travel
Okay.
in it. And this person came back from the future to save the
Mm,
past. That's where this person
okay.
came from. And so did so did the 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 enemy that she was tasked to
Oh,
defeat.
okay.
And one of them survived as well. And so the story is about their conflict spilling onto Earth from the future of
Oh,
humanity.
that's so interesting.
It's a pretty cool premise, and the whole story is just entertaining. Like I say, it's kind of brain candy. It's
Yeah.
fun. It's just fun.
And I love books like this. And I think we talked about this earlier of just even what you're doing. It's like when I'm reading, I'm like, how do they create these worlds in their mind? And then they have the ability to like put them into words so we can also take part in the world that you have created. And I think that's so cool.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I honestly, I have felt ever since I was a kid, I felt a real burden to write these sorts of stories, to write the deep stories that actually have some myth, some truth, whether I like it or not. It's just
Yeah.
there. You know what I'm saying? And that I just hope to put that across to people, and that is what I tried to do with
Yeah.
Brightstar. And so for listeners here, anybody who's listening, if you're interested, the book is published by technically a traditional
Okay.
publisher, though they're a bit of a non-traditional publisher, but it is published by a traditional publisher. If you're interested, you can find it anywhere where you would normally buy books. I would highly recommend going to local booksellers
Yes.
because local businesses are so
Yeah.
important, and it's so easy to forget them with all the online stuff. So local booksellers are a really great idea. And um, if you're interested in the story, and I do have a short story on my website that's for
Okay.
anybody to read. Uh, that is acts as a prologue to Brightstar of sorts. It happens in the few minutes before Brightstar, or the few days and then few minutes before Brightstar enters the new
Okay.
universe.
I love
So
it. Can you tell
it's
us what your
yeah,
website is, where we can find this?
I
Oh,
was about to
okay.
grab that.
Perfect.
So you can the the easiest way to find it is the letter E, the number 6,
Okay.
universe.com.
Okay.
e6universe.com is the easiest way to find the website. And the short story is The Keeper of the Mysteries. So if your interest is piqued, feel free to head over there. It's not a very long read. It'll take you 20 minutes or something to read the short story, and it'll give you sort of a peek into the universe that I've created. And
Cool.
you could yeah, so that'd be a great way to find out if you
Yes,
want
and
more.
listeners, I'll have the link to the website in the show notes as well. So if you're driving, you can feel free to click into the show notes later. You don't need to try to jot that down while you're driving. So don't worry about that. And how I love to end the show here is with our bonus pairings. These are
Yeah.
just a speed round of questions. Do you prefer audio or hard copy books?
Most of the time I prefer audio because my mind is doing five
Yeah.
things at once. So if I can be doing two things and an audiobook, then I've got enough to keep me busy.
All right. And then where is your favorite place to read?
Well, if I'm doing an audiobook and I'm just relaxing, I like to play a video game, play a computer game, sit in front of my computer and veg. I'll play a game and
Yeah.
read, or listen at the same time. If I'm reading a physical book, I actually like to read in bed or on the couch.
Yeah.
I'll sit on the couch, sit in bed and read.
And then what is one book you've read that has changed your life?
Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card was one that did. I would say some of the C.S. Lewis books have. I would actually point to one of his nonfiction books as one of the ones that I found the most compelling recently. It was The Great Divorce, which is the description of heaven and hell from a story perspective, and how he paints, just as one example, he paints hell as a city that goes infinitely in all directions, and the people there just move further and further apart because they can't stand each other. And that is so, what would you call it, symbolically correct on so many levels that it leaves me sort of in wonder. He just nailed it.
Yeah, I haven't read that one, but I have a dear friend here who loves C.S. Lewis, and she's also one of her favorites. So
I would highly recommend that book to anybody, the Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, because the things that he says are just so profound there.
All right, 2024 reading list is growing. All right, and lastly,
Absolutely.
What are you reading next?
Well, I have a book by a local author. I can't actually remember the name of it, but it's an Alaskan adventure from an author. I got it at a local authors gathering. I traded her one of mine for hers, and it's a fun one. That's one that I'm reading next. One I'm working on right now it's called Ex Nihilo, I think it is, but it's an indie book by a guy who's sold literally maybe 20 or 30 copies of the thing. So I'm doing that, and I'm going to try to review it for him.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I know your time is precious, and I appreciate all that you've given me.
Well, Kara, thank you for having me. It has been a genuine pleasure to talk to you, and I hope your listeners got something useful out of it. I really do.
I think so. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Jared Michaud and his book flight of mythical fantasy. We'd love to hear what other books you'd pair with these books at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information about today's book flight or other books that we talked about. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are reading next, especially if you have heard about it on the show, please tag us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Your review not only helps the show, but it also helps the podcast to reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure you will not miss an episode. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.